So as we think about Francis Crick getting the Nobel Prize in 1962, so this was about 11 years later, 10 years later, after the urea Miller experience or laboratory work. We know that Francis Crick got his Nobel Prize. We know that he was a physicist, a molecular biologist. And yet from that point on, as the years went by, especially in the 70s, 80s, 90s, into present time, think about this, that all of a sudden a word got out. What about panspermia? We're not talking about spontaneous generation. We're not talking about life here on earth to try to get the materials of inanimate materials to make life, but now we're going outside of the earth. We're going out to the universe. We're going out to where the stars and the planets are. And they start bringing up a word called panspermia. Pan meaning all, and spermia meaning seeded, seed. And so as we look at some of this list, there was something called the radiopanspermia, lethal panspermia, accidental panspermia. And when we think about the radiopanspermia, they say it was propagated in space, driven by the radiation pressure of the stars. Driven, but they wanted it to be driven by the stars and that it would hit Earth. But they realized that it had to be driven at a certain height of speed in order not to get contaminated. But still, the thought is up there. Panspermia, the hypothesis goes. Then you got lethal panspermia. Lethal panspermia is the transfer of organism in rocks from one planet to another and then hitting Earth, dropping down, seeded, sperma, seeded on Earth. And then you got another one called accidental panspermia. This is a cosmic garbage, they call it. The life on Earth might have originated accidentally from a pile of waste producing, dumped on Earth long ago. How? By extraterrestrial beings. And now they're talking about beings, extraterrestrial aliens coming from another planet. You see, that's how difficult it was to begin to think about, even if I were able to bring some amino acids into life or bring them into the experiment, amino acids, we still needed the bonding of all these left amino acids to produce even a protein to begin to even talk about, let alone what came first, the protein or the DNA. But that's another topic. We're talking about panspermia. They said that extraterrestrial beings might have produced this on Earth. But let's look at Francis Crick. In 1973, that's 10 years after he got his Nobel Prize, he called something, and he quoted something called the direct panspermia. This wasn't a quote from him, but this is what he pretty much said in a paraphrase. He said, he suggests that the universe is sufficiently old that other intelligent civilizations could have risen elsewhere in the universe, and one of these other intelligent civilizations could have built some kind of spacecraft and seeded the universe with life. From a laboratory work done here on Earth to now out in the universe, what brought life? This is where they're at. To even, because they don't want to turn to the Christian worldview, talking about a God that's outside of time, space, and matter, a God that has a God of order and design, they'd rather go to aliens. And they say that's not difficult to see. So this British physicist, the molecular biologist Francis Crick, we go up to 1981, another 10 years, another decade later. He writes a book. And Francis Crick, think about this, guys. Think about this when you're thinking about weighing out worldviews. In 1981, so about 40 years ago, he writes a book called Its Origin in Nature, and this is what he says as a molecular biologist. He says this in his book: an honest man armed with all the knowledge available to us now, 40 years ago, could only state that in some sense, the origin of life appears at the moment to be almost a miracle. So many are the conditions which would have had to have been satisfied to get it going. And we advance this another 8 years, 7 years, as Francis Crick would make another suggestion, not a suggestion, a quote, but a suggestion to the other biologists, to the other scientists. So Francis Crick in 1988, as he was pursuing how to bring life from non-life, the book was called What Mad Pursuit. And he says this, that the biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed, rather evolved. Think about what he's saying. That the biologist must keep in mind always when he's looking that, yeah, it looks designed. But we know our presupposition is that it's naturalism, and therefore we will not look towards a transcendent God, a transcendent being who's all powerful. So we'll have to make sure we understand that it's evolved. I'm going to finish it up here. Psalms 8. Here David was writing 800 years before Jesus walked on earth as a historical figure. And David was writing from the mind of God when he wrote this. And he says, when I consider the heavens and the works of your fingers, the moon and the stars that you have ordained, what is man that you are mindful of them? Think about that. Here God is saying, listen, I'm God from all eternity. And as you look at the heavens, I want you to understand that you know I created these things. This is what Romans 1 tells us, that you know that you are without excuse, that you know there had to be an ultimate God who created this universe. And as you consider the heavens, God says he upholds the moon and the stars in place to be moving in season every single day. That you would have the benefits of knowing that we can do science because God has upheld all things by his authority, ordained it to be so, the stars and the moon. This is the other worldview that clashes against no God. And finally, God wants to tell you this, and this is the end of it. God wants to tell you that he's personal. So he says, what is man in Psalms 8? That you are mindful of him. And that you visit the Son of Man. You see, God came down to visit us. What is man that God would do that? And yet that trips up the naturalist, the atheist, that this all-powerful God would come down as a man and feel our temptations, feel our trials, feel the things that we are going to do, where he was tired, lonely, hated, betrayed. And yet it's this God that says, what is God that he is mindful of man, that he would go visit him? And then the last of that verse, it says this, and you have crowned him with glory and honor. The only way that we can have glory and honor is that we put on the very image of God who created us, that we would know what justice, beauty, and love is, and that we were made to go out and let people see us and identify that this that we have, the naturalists cannot explain in their worldview, the scientists can't explain, but God says, I made you with that intent in my image. So think about these things, guys, as we weigh out these worldviews with truth, the inference, facts, the reality that we live in, and does it make sense? And I'll see you Thursday as we talk about worldviews and why it matters.